Welcome to the 360 podcast, an all-round look at student-centered education. I'm Adrian Pumphrey, and this week I talk with psychologists Dr. Robert Evans and Dr. Michael Thompson, authors of the NAIS publication Hopes and Fears, Working with Today's Independent School Parents. We discuss characteristics of independent school parents, as well as ways to best support students through developing and maintaining the parent-teacher relationship. Enjoy the episode. Well, Rob and Michael, thank you so much for joining us on the 360 podcast. It's a delight to have you with us.
Thanks for inviting us.
Yes.
I wanted to start at the very beginning, at thinking about why is it that parents decide to send their kids to independent schools? So what is their motive for sending their child to an independent school?
It's one of the biggest decisions that parents make because it's a huge commitment financially. And they do it because of their hopes for their children and because of their worries for their children. The hopes are that they want their children taught in an environment which will actualize their child's potential. Mm-hmm. There's one independent school whose motto is every child known, every child loved. I mean, isn't that what every parent wants?
Yeah.
Every child known and cared about, right? And the local public school might not be able to do that. There might be too many demands on them, too little resources, too large classes. So parents, it's always a combination of hopes and fears. And that's why Rob and I entitled our book on the subject, Hopes and Fears, because parents are hoping that their child will be seen and well taught and supported and cared about and protected emotionally and on and on. The list of hopes is almost as long as there are parents, because all the hopes are custom tailored to the child, right? And then there are also a list of fears of what might possibly go wrong in another setting. So that's why they send their children to independent.
So, Adrian, here's an example. My wife and I lived in a wealthy Boston suburb with really good public schools. But we ended up sending our kids to independent school. I'm an independent school grad, and that had something to do with it. But the schools in question were quite large. They had excellent teachers. And when we chose an independent school, we did not think we were purchasing better teaching, but we were purchasing a different context for good teaching to occur in. Smaller classes, smaller pupil loads per teacher, more chance, as Michael just said, for our children, our boys, to be known, to make connections, both to other kids, but also to teachers, and actually other things too, more chances to play on a team. So in our case, the question of size made a huge difference because for us, it was bearing directly on the potential for relationship. But at least in our case, there are many places in the country where the public school teaching is seen as not so good. But in lots of independent schools are located in areas where the public schools are actually quite good. And when people make this choice, and it's often an expensive choice, I think one of the things they are looking for is just what Michael said: the child be seen and known, ideally loved, but connected with.
And you're in Massachusetts, am I right?
Yes.
So yeah, it's one of the best public school systems in the country. Yeah. So it's also there's so many independent schools in that state too.
Yes,
an interesting dynamic.
Right. It's why it's one of the most intelligent places on earth. Massachusetts.
Of course. Let's dig a little deeper into the mind of the independent school parent. You mentioned hopes and fears, and I know you write about that. You list some of those in the first part of your book. Maybe you could give us a sense about, Rob, perhaps you can attest to this. What is unique about the independent school parent, perhaps as opposed to someone that might decide not to send their child to independent schools?
Well, if I were going to be blunt, one key difference is that most of them can afford it.
Mm-hmm.
And the truth is that, you know, if you think about any area in the country, tuitions are different in certain places, more expensive in some cities, but so on. But in any given locale, the independent school is the most expensive option in town, more expensive than Catholic schools, parochial schools, more expensive than other private schools typically, and certainly than public schools. So, I mean, there is, if we were just being blunt about it, there is a difference that way. But in terms of expectations, part of what comes with that is that people who pay more often feel they can expect more.
Mm-hmm.
So when Michael was talking a minute ago about hopes and fears, there's a combination that comes there in which people expect, well, I'm sending my child to your independent school, and I expect things to go right. I'm worried, I want things to go right, of course, my hopes are, but I sort of expect it, that, you know, that's what I'm entitled to in a way. And there are many similarities between those parents who send their children to top-notch public schools and those who send their children to independent schools. But when you're paying that extra money, and when you have made a specific choice of a place, you often have a higher set of expectations and less tolerance for something not going right. And so one of the things that I think has often been true about independent school parents is that they come with often with significant expectations.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Go on, Michael.
I like to describe them as above average anxious because many independent school parents live in a fine suburb and are paying a huge property tax. So they're essentially paying one tuition. What prompts them to pay a whole second tuition is often their worries. And so they're above average expectations, as Rob was saying, but they're also above average anxious. Mm-hmm. And they can imagine calamities and things that their child might not be able to bear in a system. So they want to know that there will be a custom tailored education for their child. But it's not just raw entitlement. That's a misunderstanding mm-hmm. of the independent school parent. They care deeply about education.
Yeah.
They're willing to not just talk the talk, but walk the walk and write the check mm-hmm. in order to have a superb education that really fits who their child is, because the underlying fears, it won't speak to my child, and this is my only chance for this child, right? Mm-hmm. I don't want to experiment. I don't want people just messing about with my child or making the system good 3 years after my child leaves. Mm-hmm. I want it for my child now.
Absolutely. And I know you talk about the great irony of that parents care deeply about their children, and then the teachers care deeply about the children, but then there can be often this, when expectations don't match, there can often be that can be a source of tension. And so can you talk a little bit about where these flashpoints often lie in the parent-teacher relationship?
You pointing to me, Ron?
I'm pointing to you, Michael.
Okay. The developmental flashpoints, a chapter that came out of thoughts that I have, but there are actually two sources of flashpoints. One is that being a parent and being a teacher are two different jobs. Mm-hmm. And one involves love and no objectivity, and the other involves a lot of caring, sometimes love, but objectivity. Mm-hmm. And that makes the roles very, very different, right? Most parents would not give their own child a B-. Mm-hmm. But a teacher might well give a child a B-. That's the objectivity. And the moment you have one person who's objective and the other person who's not objective, the potential for conflict is always there. That's structurally built in. The other thing is that all parents are amateurs. And when your child is 5 for the first time, that throws you. And you get used to there being a dawdling 5-year-old, and then they're all of a sudden a bossy 6-year-old, and that throws you. And then you have a quite disrespectful 12-year-old, and that throws you, right? And then you have a 17-year-old who doesn't tell you anything about their life, and that throws you. And so there are going to be points along the way where, as a parent, you're going to be thrown by something that your child is doing as a result of their development, their temperament, their individual personality, truly, but development. And that's why parents often get annoyed with middle school teachers who may think are encouraging bad behavior in 7th graders, or not making them as obedient and compliant and lovely as they were in 5th grade. That's the 7th grade teacher's problem. It's the fact that the child is no longer a 5th grader. So we examine this in the book and look for the likely developmental flashpoints that are inevitably going to rise in childhood and adolescence.
And one of the things that's important to add about this is that these flashpoints, the way Michael just summarized them, are rooted in normal growth and development. They're not a function of some dysfunction or pathology. They're just normal, and they just happen. And parents are often ill-equipped for them. That's true. Teachers get used to it, because if you teach 7th graders for 10 years, you've seen a lot of the typical 7th grade stuff.
Right.
But it isn't necessarily easy when you're in the teacher's slot to know how to deal with the parent about this. And one of the things we talked about in the book is, in fact, that so for example, back to school nights, just giving the parents sort of the outline of the 7th grade curriculum may not be as useful altogether as adding something about the normal developmental stuff that typically happens and that kids go through and grow through. And many teachers have been often more anxious about being seen to be truly professional by parents, and so eager to come across that way and to present themselves that way, that it sometimes hasn't been as likely for them to say, so here's what kids are like here, and this is how we kind of cope with that. Here's some of what you may expect, some of that. And we actually think it's helpful when teachers can give parents a little more developmental perspective, as opposed to just chapter and verse about curriculum and what we're going to cover this year and the kind of facts they're going to know and what the final project is going to be. And it's not that that's unimportant or parents don't want to know. It's just that there actually is a wealth of knowledge in teachers, practical, observed knowledge, which we think is helpful to parents when faculty can share it.
But teachers don't feel they necessarily have permission to talk about what they see every day. So when a principal or administrator just talks straight, I find it so refreshing. So this story I've told many times, but a middle school public principal said to the audience of 6th, 7th, and 8th grade parents at the beginning of an academic year, she got up and she said, you know, when you send your children to us, they are babies. When they leave us 3 years later, they can have babies. all the parents went, freaked them out.
Wow.
But hey, right?
It's true.
Well, it's true. It's interesting as both an educator and a parent.
Yeah.
You would think I would bring some of that sort of expert home, but you still feel like you are. There's no book for this with parents.
So I'm so glad you said this, Adrian, because in fact, when the teacher is a parent, despite the fact that the teacher has certain kinds of knowledge, the teacher is in the same boat as other parents.
Absolutely.
Because of what Michael said earlier. when you're a parent, when you're a teacher, you have the two things. You have the caring and love about the student and some distance and objectivity. And when you're the parent, you only have the caring and the love, but not the distance and the objectivity. And many, many, many teachers that Michael and I have talked with, who we've talked with, have found that when they are in the parent chair at the conference or whatever, they have exactly the same kind of feelings that parents do who are not teachers.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yep. Adrian, I have to ask, how old are your kids? We just have to know how our responses are landing on you.
I have a 10-year-old. I have an almost 9-year-old, and I have a 5-year-old. So
okay,
yeah,
that's lovely.
Yeah,
lovely.
Keeps it lively.
We've got some bumpy years coming up.
Look forward to it. I want to, Rob, I want to revisit one of the words you mentioned in terms of the independent school parent purchasing.
Yes.
An education, purchasing, really lessening their anxiety.
Yeah.
So this, to me, brings it in a conversation of, how much is an independent school an educational establishment versus, they are purchasing a service, right?
Yep.
And so I guess my question that comes out of this is, how much am I as a teacher working for that parent and for what they have purchased versus how much am I working for the school and following their mission and whatever comes out of that, if that makes sense.
So this is a genuine dilemma and a fascinating thing that we could talk for hours about. So here's a quick take from me about it. I actually don't see, technically you could say a school is selling a service. I suppose that's technically true. I don't see it that way. To me, school is about raising the young. It's a developmental function. That's why any school, not just an independent school, has more in common with a village or a house of worship than it does with anything corporate. Because although you need customers, in quotes, who will pay your tuition, that's true. But actually, you're not turning out widgets. And I don't think you're selling a service. You're raising the young. That's a developmental function. It's much closer, as I say, to what pastors do. So to me, it's also a case where education is one of the places where the customer is not always right. In fact, the customer often knows very little about what's good educationally for a student. Even parents who are relatively young have no idea how school has changed in the last decade plus, how complex classrooms are now. You don't need me to tell you that you can have a class of 16 kids and you're actually teaching 2 or 3 classes, because you individualize and you tailor things to the needs of specific students and so on. So from where I sit anyway, the kind of, the basic sort of fundamental thing about this is that we are trying together to model for kids and raise the young. And we do that in ways that involve lots of things that you can call a service and people can expect results and stuff. And one of the trends about this that has become hardest actually is that for more and more parents over these last 15 or so years, the independent school that they're paying for has come to seem more as a kind of guarantee of where the child can go next.
Sure, yeah.
So in schools that stop in 6th grade, those that stop in 8th grade, those that stop in 12th grade, there's more and more concern on the part of parents about if she doesn't get into X next year. Parents have never not worried about that. But it used to be easier for them to feel this has been excellent and we want her to get into X. Not this is the pathway to X. So the relationship, Adrian, has actually become in many ways more transactional than it used to be. I'm paying, I want something. It's understandable. but it's actually a bad fit when the task here is to help a young person grow and become an adult.
So let me give you a specific example. If you go to some of the centers of competitiveness in the United States, let's just take New York City, let's take Manhattan. There's a huge number of independent schools in Manhattan. Rob and I have been to many of them. Wonderful, wonderful schools. But it does happen that at cocktail parties in New York, people start talking about which preschools are the best feeders for Trinity Collegiate or the Burley School for Girls, right?
Right.
And that is a really bad conversation because preschool children are quite young and we don't know much about them as students. And when their parents already are gunning for the top schools for entry at kindergarten, it's an attitude which, of course, is parent-centered and not child-centered. And educators in independent education, the best educators are always child-centered because that's whom they see as the client. When parents begin to see themselves as the customer and want the outcome that Rob's been talking about, what gets lost is the child focus.
So this, Michael, here's at the town school in New York, a wonderful progressive pre-K-8. When Joyce Evans, no relation to me, was the head, she used to say to prospective parents, your child may thrive in many schools, but you may not. And you need to pick one where you can trust the school, because she was precisely child-centered, the way Michael just said. And it is true, actually, that children may thrive in a lot of good schools, a lot of different ones. But parents, depending on their expectations and worries and hopes and fears and stuff, may not.
So my follow-up question to that is, how do we as educators shift that paradigm in terms of helping parents to shift that mindset towards a student-centered education?
Well, it starts with the admissions person in practically the first 3 sentences that she says or he says to parents. You begin a dialogue between parents and the school. This is who we are. What are you looking for? What are you hoping for? What are you worried about? Oops, there we're back at hopes and fears, right? Rob and I can be quite tiresome on the subject of hopes and fears, because I find sometimes I've walked out of a conversation with parents and I've asked it 8 different ways. And if it had gone on for 3 hours, I would have asked it 16 different ways. Because if I'm a school, I want to know what a parent is looking for their child. And if I'm a parent, I want my hopes and fears to be understood. But what I may not expect is that the admissions person says, we may be the wrong school for what you're looking for. Because I've got the checkbook, right? And I'm the parent. I'm filling a seat. My child's filling a seat in the school. But my friend Ted Scott, who was for a decade the admissions director at Concord Academy in Concord, Massachusetts, said the most satisfying interactions he had with parents were when a parent came in wanting Concord Academy, when he met the child, read the transcript, and thought this is not a match for that child, and he was able to engage in a discussion with the parent and find the right school for that parent's child, but that wasn't Concord Academy. That process has to be redone over and over. Rob and I both consulted to a K through 12 school in California, I think won't name it, where they have a sibling policy because they want it to be a family school. But they are also a really academically challenging school. So they admit siblings because they're siblings who they then need to counsel out at the end of fifth grade. Well, that's a really painful one. but it's a painful model to turn siblings down from the get-go, right?
Yeah.
There's going to be pain there. So when I was consulting to them about this issue, it was a lot about how to talk to adults. Mm-hmm. And what I knew was that there were fifth grade teachers who knew that this school was going to be an agony mm-hmm. for a particular child or two in their fifth grade classroom if they sent them on to the middle school. But to tell the parents that their child shouldn't continue in the school was a conversation so painful they didn't want to have it. And the recognition that this is built in to the structure of an independent school. Mm-hmm. It's important to acknowledge that early, and not often, but from time to time, because it's just so.
Yeah. And then you have the child that may well excel at your school. And I've certainly had sixth grade parent conferences where they've talked about Ivy League schools and how their kid is hopefully on that path. How do we help with that mindset in terms of thinking, middle school is a very unique time. Let's focus on how we can best serve them at this time in there.
Well, that sounds good.
That's a euphemistic dodge, Adrian.
Well, but you can say, so actually this let me enlarge on it a little, Adrian, and see if this makes sense to you. One of the things that we think makes a real difference is for schools to be less about promising all the applicant families that we can heal the sick and raise the dead here. Mm-hmm. And we will mix our metaphors and we'll run from pillar to post and we'll bend over backwards and we'll do everything. Actually, lots of independent schools ever since 2008 and the financial meltdown, lots of independent schools have been doing versions of this because large numbers of them would not be full if they didn't, mm-hmm. right? But actually what really helps to set a stage differently is more of the candor Michael was just talking about. So I think it's really helpful for the school to be able to say, welcome, this is who we are, this is how we do school. If it's right for your child, we'd love to have you here. And if not, there are other good schools to think of. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And to be clear upfront about what I see as the minimum non-negotiables of belonging here. And so I am going to want to know when we're asking, what are you hoping for? What are you looking for? They want to say something about the Ivy League. Depending on the parent, you would know the parent more than I wouldn't. But I could imagine scenarios in which I would say, gee, it's awfully early to be thinking about that. I can imagine saying, we actually don't pay attention to that right now. We're really focused on how she or he is doing right here, whatever. Or I could imagine saying, gee, have you been thinking a lot about that? Parents said, oh, yes, everybody in our family has gone to Yale. And so that's actually right, and then you're left sort of, at least you've learned something important.
Yeah.
Right. But at that point, once I've heard something from them, I would want to say, it's really important that we focus on him or her as he or she is now, and her development and growth and learning now, and not with a view to something that is at least 6 years off or whatever. And we do worry if parents put too many eggs in that basket too early. Mm-hmm. I wouldn't mind being blunter than we have often been in past years. You can say it very nicely. You can say it without any animosity or venom or anything like that. But you can at least encourage parents to damp it down some. And the main reason here is because of what we know about its impact on kids. If their parents are talking about Yale nonstop in 6th grade, or even not nonstop, but a lot in 6th grade, because the picture is not pretty. Mm-hmm. And Yale takes 4 out of 100 at this point, probably less than that this year. I do think it's good for the school as an institution from the get-go to clarify what it means to belong here. And then for the teachers as individual practitioners to be able to encourage parents to keep the focus on the child now.
Because as the child grows older, he or she decides what kind of a student they're going to be and how they're going to do school. You know, I'm a supervising consultant for an all-boys school. And I have had hundreds of boys tell me, I know it's upsetting to my parents that I'm not an A student, but I'm going to do this student. I'm going to be a B student here. It's a very good school. They're going to get me into a good enough college. And the way I'm going to do school, I'm not going to destroy my life trying to be an A student. And when a 15-year-old boy tells you that, it has the ring of truth to it. It's a kind of a steely strategy to which he's committed. And I've never seen a parent. Well, let me tell a story. I was once down at a boys' school in Dallas, and a father stood up and said to me, Dr. Thompson, I'm a physician. How do I motivate my son? And I said, motivate him to do what? He said, to get A's. And I said, well, how old's your son? He said, 15. I said, what does he get for grades now? And he said, B's. And I said, what did he get last year? In ninth grade, he said, B's. And I said, what did he get in seventh and eighth grade? And he said, B's. And I paused because I knew I was going to irritate this man. But I said, your son is a B student. He said, I know that. Tell me how to turn him into an A student. And I said, I've actually never seen a father find the magic key and insert it into the child's back and suddenly, you know, gin them up magically. Most children by 10 or 11 or 12, and I know I'm saying this now to the father of a 10-year-old, they have a sense of what school is like for them and how they're going to do their school journey, no matter what their parents' ambitions are.
Yeah, I'll get back to you on that one. As what happens?
Okay. You know, but Adrian, truly, part of what needs to happen as our children grow up, and it happens for all of us, whether we're educators or psychologists or something else, is we have to come to terms with some of the things that are built into that child that can't be changed. Do you know, some kids are born extroverted, some are born more introverted, and there's nothing you can do that's going to make the one into the other. It doesn't mean you're powerless and you can't help them grow up well or they can't have great lives. It means that they're not going to become something that's fundamentally different from some of what is just built into them, literally at the DNA level. And one of the hard things for many parents, especially these days, is to sort of, because it used to be easier to accept that 50 years ago. It's harder for many parents today to sort of accept, oh, well, you know, I can't just turn her into what I think would be great for her to be. So schools sometimes have to be able to say, gee, I see that you really want him to be an A student, but it looks like he's really, you know, settled in and he's happy where he is and he's enjoying a lot of what he's doing. And, you know, this is a powerful school and he's doing well. I mean, you know, most of us remember B as being on the dean's list.
If I may push back a little bit and just play devil's advocate for a minute. We hear a lot about growth versus fixed mindset. We hear a lot about we at ParentTeacher, we've been doing a lot about mind-brain education, learning about the neuroplasticity of the brain and the changing nature of intelligence. How does that play in? You know, as we're trying to promote growth mindset, as we're trying to with this.
You pushed a button for me, Adrian. There's many people who hear about Carol Dweck's growth mindset and fixed mindset, and they think, oh, if my child just decides they're a B student, that's a fixed mindset, and I have to just get in and mold their plastic brain until they get a growth mindset and want to be an A student. And it's a complete misunderstanding of Carol Dweck. But a complete misunderstanding. Carol Dweck is not saying with a growth mindset that all children want to be A students or aspire to be A students or will work as hard as they need to be A students. What she's talking about with growth mindset is the willingness to tackle a problem and stay with it and persevere. And we know that praising children, telling them how brilliant they are, gives them a fixed mindset, which actually makes them less resilient and adaptable and less creative in problem solving. And she wants a kid who'll make an effort and be willing to tackle a problem. But that's a different kid than the straight A student. And it's a profound misunderstanding, I believe, of Carol Dweck. And it's a particularly motivated misunderstanding of Carol Dweck.
And it's also, I think, the part that isn't changeable and that actually isn't plastic is personality, temperament. It's just not. There are a lot of things that you can change. You can change what you think. You can change even ways you approach problems. You can broaden your horizons. You can leave one religion and join another, etc. But there are things about you that will never change. And you will be the same kind of believer in the second religion that you were in the first, for example. And if you're kind of shy and sort of retiring and a little hesitant to try stuff, it's possible to encourage you to be more that way, but there's no way to turn you into a radio disc jockey. And it isn't the cognitive stuff that can't change. The personality stuff is more fixed. And by fixed, it doesn't mean that nothing develops, or it just means there are basic tendencies that are there. And there are some kids who are more robust explorers, who worry less about stubbing their toe, who worry less about being embarrassed in front of other people, and so on, and others who are quite different from that. And that stuff is stuff that no school and no parent changes. So when I was saying what I did earlier, it wasn't about whether people could actually enlarge their cognitive perspective in some important ways, but whether their basic tendencies as an individual would change. And that's actually where, as psychologists, I mean, that's why we often say the character is destiny in some ways, because there are just some pieces of each of us that are who we are.
I'd like to shift gears slightly at this point and give some important airtime to the dynamic between, and I know you talk about this, between teachers and parents of color and parents of students of color. And I want to ask you about what you think is unique about that relationship, and important things to consider in light of everything we've talked about today, in terms of what is different in that relationship, and what is the same, what is universal.
Well, we write in the chapter on white teachers and Black parents. We quote one educator who says, race is always in the room. And there are teachers who want to pretend that there isn't, or it makes them uncomfortable so that they pretend there isn't, or we're, a post-racial society. We don't believe that. There's always an issue of race, because independent schools are almost all majority white. So if a Black parent or any parent of color chooses a school, they are putting their child in a school where their child's going to be in the minority. And knowing your child is going to be in the minority raises fears. My child's going to be in the minority. Most children aren't going to look like my child. Will my child be asked to the prom? Right?
Yeah.
I mean, there it is. And there are also hopes. I want my child to get an independent school education. I see this as a pathway. I'm willing to make some sacrifices and perhaps ask my child to make sacrifices. The number one sacrifice being not everybody in her class is going to look like her, right? That's a sacrifice.
Yeah.
And to pretend that it is not so, to not ask parents of color about these things, is to evade what is perfectly obvious. Mm-hmm. So what Rob and I try and do in our chapter on white teachers and Black parents is give the teachers some support and some courage to be able to ask the parents of color about why they chose the school and what they're hoping for and what they're afraid of. And we loop right back to hopes and fears, because all parents have hopes and fears.
Mm-hmm. And we would like also, you know, when we were working on the chapter, so we're both two old white guys. And we felt it was really important for us not to be pontificating about stuff from that perspective. So it's the one chapter in the book where we didn't just draw on some of our own experience, but actually went to a number of Black educators who are also parents, and talk with them and ask them these very questions. And in that chapter, the kind of things we recommend that Michael's begun to talk about made perfect sense to us, but they have for us a real ring of authenticity, because it's not stuff we just cooked up. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's stuff we agree with. So one example, for instance, is we heard from some heads of school that the school has a parents association that Black parents rarely attend, that when the association comes forward with a list of officers for next year, there's almost never a parent of color on the officer slate and so on. And what these heads were saying to us was, it's one thing to admit somebody, it's something else to make them feel like the school belongs to them too, as opposed to belonging to the majority white, and we're delighted to have some of you with us, right? And so one of the things the chapter suggests is that it's really important at the school level and at the teacher level to reach out. In fact, it's so important, I think we said it 3 times, Michael, reach out, reach out, reach out. And to be overtly interested and curious and inquiring and wanting to know, rather than imagining, evading, and thinking, oh, well, you know, really there aren't any color differences here. Mm. And we're not in favor of exaggerating them, mm-hmm. but we're definitely in favor of not avoiding them. Mm. And our take is, and it was actually reassuring to hear this from many of the people who told us this, that in fact, it really does make a difference when the school is reaching out, rather than when it is just imagining somehow that it's all fine and we shouldn't really talk about it much in any specific terms with anybody. You don't have to beat people over the head.
Right.
Be able to say in a first conference of the year something that's going to indicate and ask, and you know, and we're hoping that teachers will feel more empowered to do that without having to feel that they're experts about race relations. Mm-hmm. But that they would.
We had a Black father who said, I just want to know that my son's teachers are thinking about my son's racial identity.
Oh, yeah.
As a Black boy.
That's all. He didn't want more than that.
Simple, right? But from the heart.
Yeah.
Our first conferences are not until the midway through the first semester.
Yeah.
How do we do that from the start? You know, I'm thinking I would want my parents of color to know that right from the start. What are good ways to reach out?
Call them up.
Mm.
Call them up.
Yeah.
Or when you see them on the first day, if they brought the kid to school or whatever, you say, you know, I'd like to. Actually, I know some teachers who like to do this with all their parents. It's a personal call at the start of the year. Something like that, and a chance to talk and to ask and to find out, and you know, and you don't have to be crudely nosing into people's lives to want to know what it was that they brought them here, what they're looking for. Is there anything they'd like you to know about their son or about their daughter as you head into the year? And to me, it's not just the specifics you would ask, Adrian, but the fact that you would ask. And that they would feel that you genuinely want to know what's going to help make this a good experience for that child.
And you could ask the parent, and has this been a comfortable community for you?
Yeah.
To join?
That's a great question. Wow.
And if the answer is no, I would want to say, well, can you tell me more about that?
Yeah. I know in the book you mentioned some skills for teachers to have. I know active listening is one of those skills. I think that
big surprise there from two psychologists, right?
There it is. But I think, you know, a lot of these things, I mean, I really appreciated the book, but a lot of these things can come out of that listening, right? And that's a good first.
Yes. And the irony is, you know, if you were to say to me, well, what's one quick thing that a teacher should know about any communication with any parent and how they could be helpful? I would say, put on the hat you would wear if you were talking to a student. Not because you'd be condescending, teachers don't condescend, but because a lot of what you would say to the student will work equally well with parents. And to be able to say, oh, gee, tell me more about that. And then what happened? Gosh, that must have been hard. I mean, teachers do that all the time with students. And there are lots of conversations. The parent says, you know, well, you know, I think that you're not rigorous enough here, and my son is bored. And the teacher can say, well, actually, let me show you my curriculum map again, and sort of, et cetera. Or you can say, gee, tell me more about that. And you draw out and you listen a little, active listening. And then when you give an answer, they're going to be better able to hear it than if you tried to immediately explain it away and nail it down tight. And too often teachers feel they have to do that with parents in a way they wouldn't feel they'd have to do it with students.
So I don't want to give away all the secrets of our book, because every
quite right, yeah,
own it. So you mentioned active listening, but if you were actively listening to Rob, there's three parts to it. One is a willingness to ask questions of other adults. Many teachers don't feel comfortable doing that. Then you actively listen to their answer, and then you address their concerns with straight talk. Ask questions, active listening, straight talk. But there are other secrets that...
Oh, many.
many. You have to buy the book to find.
I can attest to that. There is many topics that we haven't been able to include in this conversation.
Thank you, Adrian.
I encourage everyone to go out and buy this. The link will certainly be in the show notes, so we will make that available to everybody, but I highly recommend the book. Thank you for spending the time to write this. I really appreciated reading it. I've learned a lot through that and talking with you this morning. So thank you so much for joining us. It's been a delight to talk with you.
Oh, it's been great fun. Thank you.
That was psychologists Dr. Robert Evans and Dr. Michael Thompson, authors of the NAIS publication on hopes and fears, working with today's independent school parents. We'll be sure to put the link to the book in the show notes, and we highly recommend it to you. Otherwise, we'll see you next time.